Chapter 7 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 7, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 7, Grant's May Battles in Mississippi. General Grant passed the night of the 29th of April, 1863, in giving minute and elaborate orders for the movement of the morrow. He provided for the safety of his camp against sudden attack, for the bringing forward of a full supply of rations. He ordered the chief commissary of the 13th Corps to provide that command with 3 days' rations for their subsistence for 5 days, writing all these orders with his own hand. Early on the morning of the 30th, McClernand's corps passed down the river, closely followed by McPherson, and landed at Bruinsburg, 6 miles below Descrunes, on the east bank. It was Grant's intention to go to Rodney, 10 miles further, from which point he knew there was a good road to Port Gibson, but he ascertained from an intelligent negro that a road ran directly from Bruinsburg over the hills to that place. He therefore hurried McClernand's force over the river with the greatest dispatch, and as soon as they could be supplied with rations for 3 days in their haversacks, they set out for the hills, 2.5 miles inland, which they found, to their great relief, entirely unoccupied. They had still an hour of daylight before them, and Port Gibson was only 10 miles away. They marched through the late afternoon and far into the night, meeting no obstacle until, about an hour after midnight, McClernand's skirmishers came up with the enemy, posted 4 miles to the west of Port Gibson. This was a village deriving its sole importance from the junction of a number of radiating roads, one of which commanded the route of retreat from Grand Gulf by way of Willow Springs, 10 miles to the east. It was the first place at which the advance of Grant could be disputed, and its occupation would render Grand Gulf untenable. Both sides rested on their arms until morning, when, with the earliest light, the Battle of Port Gibson began. The Confederate forces consisted of a portion of the garrison of Grand Gulf, which had been hastily detached as soon as General Bowen became aware of the flanking movement of the day before. Pemberton had also taken the alarm, and had ordered Stevenson to send the 5,000 men already directed to be held in readiness. The road from Bruinsburg divides some 4 miles west of Port Gibson to meet again before entering the town, and it was there that McClernand's advance had found the Confederates posted. Greene's brigade on the south branch of the road, and E.D. Tracy's on the north. The Confederates made a brave stand, and were greatly assisted by the character of the ground, which was rough and broken and almost impassable, by cause of steep ravines and undergrowth. But the Union force was too heavy for them. Peter J. Osterhaus's division was placed on the left, and attacked Tracy's brigade on the northern road. The divisions of E. A. Carr, Hovey, and Andrew J. Smith attacked Greene an hour later on the southern road. He was soon dislodged by the Union right, and driven slowly along the road, but Tracy held Osterhaus in check until later in the day, when Logan's division of McPherson's corps came on the field, and McPherson brought 1 brigade of it into the fight under his own eye. The enemy soon gave way in front of McPherson and Logan, and although reinforced from Vicksburg during the fight, his whole line speedily followed, retreating through Port Gibson and taking refuge for the night beyond the forks of Bayou Pierre. General Bowen, with his 8,000 men, including his reinforcements, had made a gallant fight, but it was useless for him to attempt to stand against 19,000. The losses on each side were nearly equal, the Union loss being 875, and the rebel loss 832. General Pemberton, who was by this time convinced that an attack in force was in progress on his left flank, and that Grant's army was pouring through Bruinsburg like a flood through a crevasse, had left Jackson and hurried to Vicksburg, calling in his scattered detachments from every side to oppose the invasion. He made what hasty dispositions were in his power to defend the line of the Big Black River. General Loring was ordered from Meridian to Rocky Springs, and sending Lloyd Tillman to Grindstone Ford on the north bank of Bayou Pierre, to delay if possible the crossing of the National forces at that point, he rode over to Grand Gulf, and after consultation with Bowen, who had retreated there after the Battle of Port Gibson, the place was hurriedly evacuated and at once occupied by Admiral Porter. As soon as day dawned on the 2d, McClernand's corps dashed into the town and beyond, until their progress was arrested on the south fork of Bayou Pierre, where the Confederates, in retreating, had burnt the bridges. The Union troops set to work with the utmost zeal to build them anew, floundering in the water, swarming like bees over the blackened timbers, and tearing down all the houses within reach for planking. Two of Logan's brigades, not waiting for the completion of the bridges, forded the bayou and pushed on to the left. Reinforcements to Grant were constantly arriving from the west side of the river, and McPherson's corps, having been strengthened by the addition of M. Crocker's division, Grant ordered him to push forward and attack the enemy in the direction of Willow Springs. He reached the North Fork at Bayou Pierre and found the grindstone bridge over it on fire. He repaired it during the night and crossed his troops at daylight. Meeting with little resistance on the northern bank, he drove the enemy through Willow Springs, thus cutting off what garrison there might be at Grand Gulf from communication with their friends on the east. Logan and Crocker kept up the pursuit, with occasional skirmishing and capture of prisoners all day, till the enemy were driven to Hankinson's Ferry over the Big Black, 15 miles northeast of Port Gibson. McPherson at this point was so close upon the heels of the rebels that he seized the bridge before they had time to fire it, and established himself firmly there. Grant, with a cavalry escort of 20 men, meanwhile rode straight for Grand Gulf, which he found was evacuated and the navy in possession. Porter was absent, having started that morning to lend Farragut a hand at the mouth of the Red River. Grant's blows in the last few days had fallen so hard and so fast that the enemy had not had leisure to save his heavy guns, and as the victorious general inspected the formidable arms and the system of works which, seen from the rear, were far more extensive than they appeared from the river, he had reason to congratulate himself on the wisdom of the march to Bruinsburg, which had avoided the danger and the bloodshed involved in a direct attack upon the fortifications of Grand Gulf. It was now 3 days since he had been in bed or undressed, so he begged a change of linen on board one of the gunboats, and thus refreshed, spent the greater part of the night in writing dispatches. It is astonishing to see the amount of work, the thought, care, and minuteness of detailed instruction which he crowded into those few hours. He wrote to General Halleck, giving a full account of his expedition up to date; to Sherman, ordering him to effect a junction with the main body as soon as possible, full of details as minute as the following: "I wish you to collect a train of 120 wagons at Milliken's Bend and Perkins's plantation. Send them to Grand Gulf, and there load them with rations as follows: 100,000 pounds of bacon, the balance coffee, sugar, salt, and hard bread," etc. With equal detail he gave orders for the construction of a road for land transportation from Young's Point to a landing below Warrenton. All his faculties seemed sharpened by the emergency. There was nothing too large for him to grasp, nothing small enough for him to overlook. He had heard that day of Grierson's raid, and its thorough success had contributed to the steady elation which is visible in all his utterances of that day. He says to General Halleck his army is in the finest health and spirits, "composed of well-disciplined and hardy men, who know no defeat and are not willing to learn what it is. The country," he further says, "will supply all the forage required for anything like an active campaign, and the necessary fresh beef. The other supplies will have to be drawn from Milliken's Bend. This is a long and precarious route, but I have every confidence in succeeding in doing it. I shall not bring my troops into this place, but immediately follow the enemy, and if all promises as favorably hereafter as it does now, not stop until Vicksburg is in our possession." In this last phrase we find the only intimation which he gave to the Government at that time of the campaign upon which he was resolved, a resolution which was the turning point of his career, for in that day's resolve was the germ of the victories of Vicksburg and Chattanooga, of Appomattox and the Presidency. It had been his intention, as he said in his dispatch from Vicksburg 3 weeks later, to, quote, detach an army corps of the necessary force to cooperate with General Banks to secure the reduction of Port Hudson and the union of the two armies, end quote. But having received a letter from Banks, stating that he could not be at Baton Rouge before the 10th of May, and that after the reduction of Port Hudson he could only add 12,000 to the force in the field, Grant instantly concluded that he would make his campaign without reference to Banks. He felt, rather than knew, the dispositions of the enemy opposed to him. By keeping his army well in hand, he could interpose it between the force of Pemberton, now collected on the line of the Big Black on his left, and the force which Johnston would naturally collect about him at Jackson. He knew he was stronger than either of these bodies, and in striking contrast with those generals in the East who constantly multiplied in their imagination the force of the enemy, it was the habit of Grant to make the opposite error, and to minimize a hostile force which he could not see. He estimated at this time Pemberton's force at about 3/5 of its actual strength. The exigencies of his first day's battle, and the pursuit of the retreating enemy, had brought him 15 miles in the direction of the Confederate army. He felt it would be wasting too much time at that stage of the campaign to countermarch that distance to join General Banks. It will be no disparagement to Grant if we admit the possibility of another consideration which may have influenced him at this moment. Banks, as Badeau says, was his senior, and on the junction of their forces must have assumed command, and it will not be accusing Grant of any taint of vanity, presumption, or ambition to say that he probably felt that for the work in hand he was a better man than Banks. Having taken this momentous resolution, upon the result of which depended either the greatest military service ever rendered the Republic and an immortal fame, or, in the other event, irremediable failure and disgrace, and then, having sat down without a tremor of the pulse to give directions to generals, sea captains, quartermasters, and commissaries for every incident of the opening campaign, Grant mounted his horse again and rode to his troops at Hankinson's Ferry, where he found his own troops and personal luggage had arrived. Since leaving Hard Times, his sole worldly gear had been a toothbrush. He had taken from day to day the first horse he could lay his hands on, and had shared the luncheon of any general near whom he happened to halt. His forces remained for 3 days at Hankinson's Ferry, waiting for supplies and reinforcements from across the river, which were constantly arriving. Though the army was on short rations of bread, they had in this fertile and populous district a great plenty of other things, and after the long months of levee, swamp, and bayou, they heartily enjoyed those first days of high and dry land, of fresh beef and poultry. The men were not entirely idle. General Grant employed the time in demonstrations on both sides of the Big Black, for the purpose of inducing the enemy to think that his intentions pointed in that direction. But on the morning of the 7th, the army, in high health and spirits, broke camp and started on their march towards the center of the enemy's line between Vicksburg and Jackson. "It was my intention here," says General Grant, "to hug the Big Black River as closely as possible with McClernand's and Sherman's corps, and get them to the railroad at some place between Edwards's Station and Bolton." He intended McPherson, commanding the right wing, to move by way of the village of Utica to Raymond, and thence to make a rapid dash upon Jackson, the capital of the State, to do what damage might be swiftly wrought upon the railroad and public stores, and then to rejoin the main army. A close watch was to be kept on the ferries of the Big Black to prevent the sudden descent of a body of the enemy upon his line of communication. In this order, therefore, the army moved north a march of 5 days, McPherson holding the right, McClernand the left, Sherman following McClernand, and gradually coming to the center abreast of him. On the morning of the 12th, McPherson struck a brigade of the enemy commanded by General John Gregg, supported later by another under General W. H. T. Walker at Raymond. Logan's division first attacked and gradually pushed the enemy before him for 2 or 3 hours, until on the arrival of Crocker's division the Confederates broke and retreated towards Jackson, Logan following in pursuit until night. General Grant during the battle was with Sherman, 7 miles west of Raymond, and about the center of the army. This sharp action, and additional reports which Grant had received of the arrival of considerable reinforcements under Johnson at the State capital, determined him to countermand the orders under which the left wing and center were now marching to the railroad, and he directed both Sherman's and McClernand's corps to concentrate upon the right, while McPherson pushed forward towards Jackson. Grant was determined, as he says, to make sure and leave no enemy in his rear. The army was certainly fortunate in the possession of a general who could change his plans at a moment's notice to suit the exigencies of the hour, and of officers and troops who could march as fast and as far as it suited their general to command them. McPherson pushed to the north from Raymond, occupying the town of Clinton on the railroad between Jackson and Vicksburg, thus interposing his corps between Johnston and Pemberton, and Sherman, with equal celerity, marched on the direct route between Raymond and Jackson, arriving south of the town just as McPherson arrived, in a pouring rain, on the north side. On the 9th of May, the Confederate government, seriously alarmed at Grant's march into the interior, had ordered General Johnston to proceed at once to Mississippi with 3,000 good troops and take command of the forces there. The fatal divergence of views between Johnston on the one side and the Confederate government on the other had continually widened since the conference at Grenada some months before. Pemberton was constantly importuning Johnston for reinforcements which the latter could not send him, and in the latter part of March he made an urgent request that Van Dorn's cavalry might be returned to him from the Army of the Tennessee. Johnston replied that that force was much more needed in Tennessee than it could be in Mississippi, and that it could not be sent back so long as that state of things existed. There is some reason in Pemberton's claim that but for his poverty in mounted troops, Grierson's raid would have been impossible, and Grant could never have advanced so easily as he did from the river into the heart of the State. But on the 12th of May, when Pemberton announced his purpose to meet the heavy force of the enemy advancing on the railroad, and asked for an immediate reinforcement of 3,000 cavalry as a positive necessity, he might as well have asked for the moon. Van Dorn had just been killed in a private quarrel. It was not possible to gather up 3,000 cavalry from any quarter, and Grant's solid legions were bringing intelligence of themselves with a rapidity that no dragoons could have surpassed. It was on a train between Tullahoma and Jackson that General Johnston received, on the 13th of May, his first intimation of the critical state of affairs from General Pemberton, and the first report he heard, on arriving at the capital, was General Gregg's narrative to him, in person, of his defeat at Raymond. On the receipt of this news, General Johnston, who was always extremely careful to perfect his written record in case of controversy arising between himself and his government, sent to Richmond this truthful but most unpalatable dispatch. I arrived this evening, finding the enemy's force between this place and General Pemberton, cutting off the communication. I am too late. Whether it be that his wounds and long illness had depressed his energies, or whether, in the circumstances of the case, it was possible for him and General Pemberton to withstand the splendid army and the swift movements of Grant, it is not to be denied that his management of the present campaign is the least creditable portion of his career. At the same time, having provided against the worst contingency by announcing to the Confederate government that he had arrived too late, he telegraphed to General Pemberton that he had learned Sherman was between them, with 4 divisions, at Clinton, saying that it was impossible to reestablish communications, that Pemberton might be reinforced, and directing him to come up in Sherman's rear at once. To beat such a detachment, he said, would be of immense value. An unnecessary truism. The troops here could cooperate. Time is all important. The whole telegram is little more than a waste of words. Pemberton, from Bovina, replied on the next day, telling what detachments he had left at Big Black and Baldwin's Ferry, 2 divisions to hold Vicksburg, leaving an available force of 16,000, with which he had moved at once. He was not to blame in hesitating to attack with this insufficient force, for although understated, it was still insufficient. The army of Grant, with 3 corps in supporting distance, any one of which would have been all that Pemberton could handle. On the morning of the 14th, Sherman and McPherson moved on parallel roads towards Jackson. In spite of a furious rainstorm, which had flooded the roads all night and continued until noon, the troops of both corps marched in excellent order, without straggling, and in the best of spirits. McPherson, on the northern road, had the bulk of the battle to his share. After a severe fight of 2 or 3 hours, the Confederates were beaten and fled by the Canton road, leading due north from the town, upon which Johnston had already carried away his most valuable supplies. Sherman was opposed on the Raymond road by several field batteries, of which he captured 3 and some hundreds of prisoners. General Grant was with Sherman, and the two met McPherson in the center of the town, from which the rebels had retreated, who laid before them some intercepted dispatches between Pemberton and Johnston, which put the Confederate plan, if it can be called by such a name, in their hands. Grant instantly ordered McPherson to march back on the Clinton road and join McClernand, while Sherman remained behind for a day to break up railroads, to destroy the arsenal and various manufacturing establishments, and then to follow McPherson. The conduct of the Confederate commanders at this juncture has been the source of endless discussion between the principal parties concerned. General Johnston severely censures the Confederate government for not properly supporting him, and Pemberton for not obeying his orders, while Pemberton endeavors in his reports to throw the blame upon General Johnston, and President Davis voluminously attacks Johnston and attempts the defense of his luckless subordinate. But looking dispassionately at the situation of the two armies on the morning of the 15th of May, it is hard to see how, with the utmost harmony and goodwill on the part of the Confederates, Grant could have been defeated. His campaign was already almost a secured success. His tremendous energy in marching had made the fighting of battles a matter of secondary importance. His army, as round and solid as a cannon ball, had been interposed between the two Confederate wings, each division within supporting distance of the rest, and although the National Army and that of the Confederates were almost exactly equal in numbers, the rebels were so scattered in every direction that it was in the power of Grant to fall with overwhelming force upon any detachment he chose to attack. At the same time, it must be admitted that both the Confederate commanders assisted his wisdom and energy by all the mistakes which it was possible for them to make. Johnston, after having been driven out of Jackson, imagined that Grant intended permanently to occupy that place, and immediately bestirred himself from his refuge on the Canton road to take ways and means to starve out Grant by cutting off his supplies, and for that intention detaching a considerable force under General S. R. Gist to the east of the town. At the same time he sent orders to Pemberton to move his army east and attack the Union rear, without any adequate comprehension of the force or the position of Grant's army; and he ever afterwards blamed Pemberton with great severity for not having carried out these orders. But when Pemberton, before the capture of Jackson, received on the morning of the 14th the first orders of this tenor, although he disapproved them and thought the result would be disastrous, he immediately prepared to obey them. He ordered his troops forward from Edwards's Station, but later in the day his doubts became intolerable to himself. He called together his principal generals in council of war, and asked for their opinions. The larger number of them were in favor of strictly obeying Johnston's orders and marching east upon the rear of the army which Johnston supposed to be between Clinton and Jackson. The two senior generals, however, Loring and Stevenson, favored a movement against Grant's line of communications, hoping in this way to cut off his supplies and compel him to retreat. This divergence of views only increased Pemberton's embarrassment, who for his part thought the wisest course was to wait for the battle, which he felt must soon come, in a place chosen by himself. But being forced to a decision, he made what was probably the worst one possible under the circumstances. He resolved to move to the southeast upon Grant's line of communication and supply, which he hoped to strike at the village of Dillon, a few miles to the east of Raymond. And even this movement was not executed promptly. The severe rainstorm, which had not been enough to keep McPherson and Sherman out of Jackson, had so swollen the creeks in Pemberton's line of march that he was forced to make a detour to find a bridge on the Clinton road. In this way the greater part of the 15th of May was wasted, and night found him only a short distance on the Raymond road, near the village of Elliston. If General Grant had himself directed the movement of the Confederate forces, he could not have disposed them more to his own advantage than Johnston and Pemberton, in their confusion, had done. With a part of Johnston's forces ordered 40 or 50 miles east of Jackson for the purpose of starving out Grant from a place he had no intention of holding, with another force to the north in search of a point of junction with Pemberton, and the latter wheeling the right wing to the south to strike the communications of an army which was living off the country, and living well, the two Confederate generals continually increased their own embarrassment by their mutual distrust and vacillation. With a force like Grant's held compactly between them, and making the most of every hour, they were still further confusing and weakening each other by dispatches which it required days to deliver, and which, when received, had been invalidated by the swift progress of events. At Elliston, on the Raymond road, where Pemberton had rested for the night and was preparing to march in the morning of the 16th, he received an order from Johnston to join him at Clinton, a place which at that moment was equally inaccessible to both of them. Although this order was a day old, Pemberton had by this time grown apprehensive of the consequences of his disobedience, and resolved to obey the command, which had become obsolete, at a moment when its execution was impossible to him. For even while he issued the order to reverse his column towards Edwards's Station, intending to seek Johnston at Brownsville, the skirmishers of McClernand's corps were already engaged with his cavalry advance. The moment Grant learned at Jackson of the intention of the enemy to join their forces and attack his rear, he determined to be beforehand with them, and ordered all his troops except Sherman to face to the west and rendezvous in the neighborhood of Bolton's Station, a point on the railroad almost exactly in the center of a quadrilateral, composed by Brownsville and Raymond on the north and south, and Clinton and Edwards's Station on the east and west. By moving promptly to this point, he felt sure of preventing Johnston's junction with Pemberton and overwhelming the latter before assistance could reach him from any quarter. This movement necessarily placed McClernand's corps once more in the lead. Hovey's division, which had relieved McPherson at Clinton when he moved on Jackson, marched straight from Clinton to Bolton, while Osterhaus and Carr, moving on what is called the Middle Road from Raymond to Edwards's Station, and Smith and Blair, the latter having just arrived from Grand Gulf with a train of 200 wagons, bearing the only supplies which Grant had received since swinging loose from the river, followed a road a few miles south of that last mentioned, all three, however, converging upon Edwards's Station and within supporting distance of each other. Grant passed the night of the 15th at Clinton, and at daylight he was aroused from sleep to listen to the report of two men employed on the railroad, who had passed through Pemberton's camp the day before, and who told him that Pemberton, with 80 regiments, was moving to attack his rear. The battle which was to decide the fate of Vicksburg was thus upon him. He sent a swift courier to Sherman to bring on his force with the utmost speed to Bolton. McPherson was ordered to push through Bolton in support of Hovey. Orders had been sent to McClernand the night before to move cautiously forward on the road leading from Raymond to Edwards's Station, taking care to keep in communication with Blair, who was temporarily placed under his orders, though belonging to Sherman's division. Grant's aversion to McClernand were shown in these orders. He did not feel inclined to leave him that freedom of action which he was always glad to give to Sherman and McPherson, and his directions were therefore unnecessarily stringent, commanding him to proceed with great caution and to take care not to bring on a general engagement. This order resulted badly the next day. When Pemberton attempted on the morning of the 16th to reverse his column for the purpose of joining Johnston north of the railroad, the power of marching away from the field he had so imprudently chosen had passed out of his hands. Just as the reverse movement was beginning, McClernand's advance drove in the Confederate cavalry pickets and opened with artillery at long range on the head, which had become the rear of their column, on the Raymond road. But General Pemberton, not being sure whether this was a reconnaissance or a serious attack, did not at once countermand his orders, but took measures for securing the safety of his trains. While his wagons were moving to the rear, he became convinced that something more serious than a reconnaissance was on hand, and he formed his troops in line of battle on the crossroad from the Clinton to the Raymond road. Loring held the right, Bowen the center, and Stevenson the left. His right thus barred the road along which McClernand's corps was advancing, and his left held a strong position called Champion's Hill, just south of the Vicksburg and Jackson Railroad, at a point where the Clinton road, running west, suddenly turns at almost a right angle to the southward, running along the base of the hill to what we have called the Middle Road, which runs, after crossing a bridge over Baker's Creek, to Edwards's Station. He had hardly completed this formation when the battle began. Grant, riding forward from Clinton in the early morning, had ordered the trains moved out of the road as he hurried on, and directed McPherson to push his troops westward at the top of their speed. At 10 o'clock he came up with Hovey, whose skirmishers were already in contact with the enemy. And after holding this division in check for some time, waiting for the advance of McClernand on the left, General Grant was probably reminded of his stringent orders of the night before by a receipt of a dispatch from McClernand about noon, already 2 hours old, asking if he should bring on an engagement. He immediately sent orders for McClernand to attack at once, but they were not received until after 2 o'clock, 3 hours after the battle had opened on the right. McPherson came on the field about 11 o'clock, Logan in the lead and Crocker following closely. Hovey's division immediately advanced along the left of the Clinton road, and moved up the eastern slope of Champion's Hill under a severe fire from the enemy posted there. Logan, who had formed on the right of the road, attacked the enemy's extreme left, and worked energetically round the northern slope of the hill, making sure and rapid progress. Hovey's division met with such heavy resistance, Pemberton continually drawing reinforcements from his right to sustain his endangered left wing, that about 2 o'clock Hovey's troops were forced back from the hill. They had captured in their advance 11 guns, and in this retreat they lost 9 of them, but being reinforced by Crocker's division, which had opportunely arrived, both divisions now rushed forward again with irresistible energy, and drove the enemy over the hill and down to the Raymond road, where they retreated in a complete rout towards Baker's Creek. Barton's Confederate brigade, which had been opposing Logan, broke about the same time, retreating across Baker's Creek by a bridge on the Clinton road. Loring on the Confederate left, whom the cautious attack of McClernand had left very much at leisure during the battle, was now called upon to cover the retreat of Bowen's and Stevenson's divisions, which were completely routed. He formed his men between the two roads, and was there attacked by Osterhaus's division and driven from his place. Falling back to the Raymond road, he found Tillman's brigade of his division had been attacked and severely handled by Smith's division, and Tillman killed. With what was left of his force, Loring hastened along the Raymond road to the ford over Baker's Creek, which he had been informed would be held by Stevenson and Bowen until he could arrive. But in saying this they promised too much, for late in the afternoon General Carr, who had crossed at the bridge, had moved down the west bank, and Stevenson and Bowen had to use all their activity to escape capture, so that when Loring arrived at the ford he found it occupied by a heavy force of Union troops, and after a comfortless night of wandering from one road and ford to another, he discovered that he was cut off from the rest of the army, and fled for the southeast, joining Johnston several days later. This, Grant said, was the hardest fought battle of the campaign. The loss of the Union army was 2,441 men, of whom 2,254 were killed and wounded. The Confederates lost 3,624, of whom 2,195 were prisoners. They left on the field 24 pieces of artillery. On the 17th, the pursuit was renewed, McClernand's corps leading, and the enemy was overtaken at the bridge over the Big Black River. A sharp action took place here. The enemy were posted in the river bottom on the east bank within a long line of rifle pits, which were defended by a bayou. They presented a somewhat formidable front as the Union army approached, but as Grant's line was extended, it was found that the rifle pits could be flanked under the cover of the river bank, and a brilliant assault by Carr's division so demoralized the enemy that little resistance was made, and a race for the bridge ensued, by which the fleet Confederates saved themselves, with heavy loss, however, in prisoners and guns. In the meantime, Sherman had reached Bridgeport, several miles higher up the river, which he crossed in the night by means of a pontoon bridge. Grant was with him, and the two generals sat on a log, looking at the passage of the troops over the bridge, which was illuminated by brilliant fires of pitch pine. McClernand and McPherson passed the night in building floating bridges, and crossed their commands early in the morning of the 18th. This unavoidable delay enabled Pemberton to bring his beaten army back to Vicksburg, a hot journey of 12 miles over dusty roads, with all the fatigue and discouragement which a week of defeat inflicts upon the bravest soldiers. But once inside the works of Vicksburg, their fortitude returned, and when the Union army, flushed with its victories, came surging up against the rebel works, it found them firmly held and stoutly defended. In the meanwhile, General Johnston, with a faith which would seem to have had insufficient nourishment under the circumstances, had been expecting to meet Pemberton's army, somewhere on the road from Livingston to Edwards's Station. It must be admitted, however, that if he were marching in view of such a junction, he moved with singular deliberation. For during the whole day of the 16th, while Pemberton was fighting the most furious battle of the campaign at Champion's Hill, Johnston, on the report of his brigadiers that their troops were tired, rested the whole day. But the next day, having resumed his leisurely march along the road indicated to him in a dispatch which Pemberton wrote him just before he was attacked, he was met by a courier dispatched by Pemberton on his retreat, with a full account of the disaster at Champion's Hill and a clear intimation of the defeat at the Big Black, where, Pemberton said, heavy cannonading is now going on. There are so many points, he continued, by which I can now be flanked, that I fear I shall be compelled to withdraw. If so, the position at Snyder's Mill (Haynes's Bluff) will also be untenable. Although this was appalling news to Johnston, he did not lose his clearness of judgment, and immediately dispatched to Pemberton the only orders compatible with common sense in the disastrous condition of affairs. If Haynes's Bluff is untenable, Vicksburg is of no value and cannot be held. If, therefore, you are invested in Vicksburg, you must ultimately surrender. Under such circumstances, instead of losing both troops and place, we must, if possible, save the troops. If it is not too late, evacuate Vicksburg and its dependencies, and march to the northeast. Of course it will be asked why Johnston did not instantly get into the saddle and, riding to Pemberton's camp, execute his own orders. The reason he gives is that his health was too infirm for him to attempt such a ride. On the next day he received another dispatch from Pemberton, announcing that he had submitted to a council of war the orders for the evacuation of Vicksburg, and it was their unanimous decision not to obey them. And this decision was accompanied by a reason more humiliating still, upon which it was founded, that it was impossible to withdraw the army from this position with such morale and material as to be of further service to the Confederacy. I have decided, Pemberton continued, to hold Vicksburg as long as possible, with the firm hope that the government may yet be able to assist me in keeping this obstruction to the enemy's free navigation of the Mississippi River. I still conceive it to be the most important point in the Confederacy. Although General Johnston considered this reasoning unfounded in view of the investment of the city and the practical nullification of the obstruction referred to by the passage of the gunboats, the situation was too distressing to him for further recriminations, and he simply replied, I am trying to gather a force which may attempt to relieve you. Hold out. It may be said that the trap was already sprung before Pemberton communicated to Johnston the decision of his council of war, which had broken up to the booming of Grant's cannons only a few hundred yards away. The army had moved forward during the 18th with the same celerity and the same solidity of column with which they had marched through the State. As they arrived in the neighborhood of the Confederate works, McClernand's force was sent to the left and McPherson's to the center, while Sherman took his corps, which had marched by the upper road, and moved to the right until he rested upon the bluffs of the Mississippi in full communication with the North. Haynes's bluff fell without a blow. A few cavalrymen riding into the works which had so long baffled the great army, and Grant and Sherman, who had come together during the last stage of the march, rode side by side up to the farthest heights of the Walnut Hills, commanding a view of the Yazoo River and the beetling bluffs where Sherman, 6 months before, had made so brave an attack and met with so disastrous a repulse. And the two friends realized, at last, that the triumphant campaign was ending, and that a victory more complete and splendid than Sherman had deemed possible, or than even Grant had anticipated, had crowned with immortal honor the Army of the Tennessee. Sherman, turning to Grant, said, quote, "This is a success, if we never take the town." Footnote. Mr. Jefferson Davis, writing 18 years after the fact, could still not reconcile himself to the success of this campaign. He enumerated the wise and prudent measures he took to oppose Grant. He says he wrote, quote, "to the Governor Pettus, a man worthy of all confidence, as well for his patriotism as his manhood, requesting him to use all practicable means to get every man and boy capable of aiding their country in its need to turn out, mounted or on foot, with whatever weapons they had, to aid the soldiers in driving the invader from our soil." The facilities the enemy possessed in river transportation, and the aid which their ironclad gunboats gave to all operations where land and naval forces could be combined, were lost to Grant in this interior march which he was making. Success gives credit to military enterprises. Had this failed, as I think it surely would have been pronounced an egregious blunder. Davis, Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, Volume 2, page 400. End of chapter 7. Recording by Owen Cook in Potawatomi ceded land.
Chapter 8 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 7, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 8, The Invasion of Pennsylvania. As soon as Hooker found himself once more on the north bank of the Rappahannock, he began to think of crossing again. As he gradually recovered the use of his benumbed faculties, he saw that, in spite of the 3 days' slaughter into which he had led and from which he had brought back his army, he had as yet fought no battle. On the 6th of May he telegraphed to the President that he had seen no way of giving the enemy general battle with a desirable prospect of success; that he had only engaged a comparatively small proportion of his troops, and that he saw a better place near at hand for the whole to join. The President, appreciating more clearly than General Hooker the deplorable effect of Chancellorsville upon the public mind, wrote to him on the 7th the following letter: quote, "The recent movement of your army is ended without effecting its object, except, perhaps, some important breakings of the enemy's communications. What next? If possible, I would be very glad of another movement early enough to give us some benefit from the fact of the enemy's communication being broken. But neither for this reason nor any other do I wish anything done in desperation or rashness. An early movement would also help to supersede the bad moral effect of the recent one, which is said to be considerably injurious. Have you already in your mind a plan wholly or partially formed? If you have, prosecute it without interference from me. If you have not, please inform me, so that I, incompetent as I may be, can try and assist in the formation of some plan for the army." Unquote. The general answered on the same day, saying that he did not deem it expedient to suspend operations on that line; that the want of success in the first attempt to extricate the army from its present position was through causes which could not be foreseen. As to the time for renewing his advance, he could only decide after he had learned more of the feeling of the troops. He said he had decided in his own mind the plan to be adopted in his next effort if the President wished to have one made. He gave no intimation of what his plan was, except that it would be one in which the operations of all the corps, unless it should be a part of the cavalry, would be within his personal supervision. In his evidence before the Committee on the Conduct of the War, he intimated that the plan he had at that time in his mind for an engagement was, "at Franklin's Crossing, where I had elbow room." Unquote. On the 13th he wrote to the President, explaining his reasons for delay. His army had been considerably reduced by the withdrawal of the 2 years and 9 months regiments, by which his marching force of infantry was cut down to about 80,000. He says that he is impatient to move, but his impatience must not be indulged at the expense of the country's interests. Longstreet is in Richmond, and can readily join Lee if attacked. The enemy's camps appear to be increasing in numbers. He now believes the enemy is numerically superior to him. He would like to have a reserve of 25,000 infantry placed at his disposal, if possible, and ends with an expression not quite in keeping with the rest of his letter, that he "hopes to be able to commence his movement tomorrow." Unquote. This hope was not fulfilled. It is doubtful if much importance was attached to it on the other side of the correspondence, for the President answered him the next day, telling him clearly that he did not then think it probable that anything could be gained by an early renewal of the attempt to cross the Rappahannock. The enemy having re-established his communications, regained his position, and received reinforcements. "I therefore shall not complain," said Mr. Lincoln, "if you do no more for a time than to keep the enemy at bay and out of other mischief, by menaces and occasional cavalry raids, if practicable, and to put your own army into good condition again. Still, if in your own clear judgment you can renew the attack successfully, I do not mean to restrain you." Unquote. At the close of the President's letter occurs a passage which bears an unhappy resemblance to the communications made to Burnside near the close of his brief command. "I must tell you," he says, "that I have some painful intimations that some of your corps and division commanders are not giving you their entire confidence. This would be ruinous if true, and you should, therefore, first of all ascertain the real facts, beyond all possibility of doubt." Unquote. There was to General Hooker in these words an ominous reminiscence of the fate of his predecessor and of his own conduct towards him, and he immediately called upon the President to ascertain what special significance they contained. The President promptly told him that he had derived his information from 2 prominent citizens of Pennsylvania, Governor Curtin and Mr. Barclay, from which General Hooker at once inferred that the center of disaffection towards him was with General Meade and General Stoneman. The great and easily earned victories which had fallen to the lot of General Lee on the banks of the Rappahannock had raised to the highest point they ever reached the spirits and the confidence of the Confederate government. The defeat of General Burnside in December, followed by the unfortunate campaign of Hooker in May, had excited in the Southern army and in the Richmond cabinet a feeling of invincibility. A corresponding depression and grief had invaded the North, which gave occasion to the manifestation of a sinister opposition to the government, from which the most serious results were hoped on the one side and feared on the other. The Richmond papers copied with the greatest elation the factious utterances of prominent Democrats of the North, and attributed to them an undue influence. A pamphlet attacking the administration is referred to by one Southern historian as the echo of the "thunder of Lee's guns of Chancellorsville." Unquote. From the rebel emissaries in Europe, also, there came letters full of hope and encouragement, saying that one or two more such victories would secure the recognition of the Confederacy by all the great powers. With more vigor and unanimity than inspired the cry of "On to Richmond," 2 years before, was General Lee now beset on every hand with the cry, "On to Washington." We are given to understand from many sources that this plan of invasion was not originally his own, and Jefferson Davis himself claims the responsibility for it, but General Lee accepted it not unwillingly. He would have been more than human if he had not been greatly elated by his victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, and the army which he saw under his orders at the end of May was by far the finest that ever gathered under the Confederate banner. It was about equal in numbers to the great army with which he raised the siege of Richmond against McClellan, and far superior to it by virtue of a year of constant success and rigid discipline. Longstreet had brought back his army from Suffolk, and the enthusiasm born of recent successes had filled the depleted regiments with the flower of the Southern youth. It was divided into 3 corps of 3 divisions each, under Lieutenant Generals Longstreet, Ewell, and A.P. Hill, and numbered nearly 80,000 men. General Lee, in his report of the 31st of July, 1863, gives a clear and simple statement of the motives which induced him to begin his enterprise of invasion. "The position," he says, "occupied by the enemy opposite Fredericksburg, being one in which he could not be attacked to advantage, it was determined to draw him from it. The execution of this purpose embraced the relief of the Shenandoah Valley, and if practicable the transfer of the scene of hostilities north of the Potomac." Unquote. He thought that the execution of this purpose would give him a fair opportunity to strike a blow at General Hooker's army in the course of the movement into which that army would be drawn; that in any event it would be compelled to leave Virginia and draw other troops to its support from a distance. Finally, "it was hoped that other valuable results might be obtained by military success." Unquote. In this last brief phrase are buried the most audacious and ambitious hopes ever entertained by the Confederate government. They expected no less than to conquer a triumphant peace in this campaign of General Lee. They looked upon their army as a machine so perfect in composition and in discipline that it could go anywhere and do anything. If the Army of the Potomac stood in its way, they expected to beat it as they had done before. It was to their minds within the range of reasonable probability that they should take Harrisburg and Philadelphia. Baltimore would be theirs without resistance, for it always pleased them to regard Maryland and its chief city as lying in unwilling bondage at the feet of Lincoln. The capture of Washington was an incident of this campaign of great expectations. It is reported that when it was suggested to General Lee that Hooker might take advantage of his absence to advance upon Richmond, he smiled and said, "Very well, in that case we shall swap queens." Unquote. The question of supplies gave him no trouble. The greater distance he marched from the plundered and wasted fields of Virginia, the better. The rich lands of the lower Shenandoah, of Maryland and Pennsylvania, were among the greatest of the temptations of this bold enterprise. There is a story, not very well authenticated, that, when General Lee made a requisition for a large amount of rations upon the Richmond government, the Confederate Commissary General endorsed upon the paper, "If General Lee wishes rations, let him seek them in Pennsylvania." Unquote. Before the end of May, Hooker began to suspect that the army across the river was on the eve of a forward movement. Spies from Richmond reported that the principal topics of conversation in that city were the funeral of Stonewall Jackson and the invasion of Maryland. Hooker, with that keenness of insight which generally characterized him, telegraphed to the Secretary of War on the 28th of May that, while he was in doubt as to the direction Lee would take, he thought it would be, quote, "the one of last year, however desperate it may appear," unquote. To ascertain more definitely if there were any actual movement in progress, he bridged the river in his front and threw the Sixth Corps over at Franklin's Crossing on the 6th of June. He saw from Falmouth Heights that the movement created a good deal of excitement in the camps opposite, and that the enemy gathered from all quarters in great force in front of Sedgwick. He therefore concluded that no movement was under way at that moment. As so often happened with General Hooker, his intuition was nearer correct than his inferences derived from actual contact with the enemy. Because Hill's forces had gathered with great alacrity to dispute Sedgwick's advance, he concluded that the enemy was not yet in motion. On the day before, he had sent a long dispatch to the President, announcing with great clearness and accuracy his views of Lee's movement, which turned out in the end to be absolutely correct. He thought Lee had in mind to cross the upper Potomac and move upon Washington, that the head of his column would be directed towards the Potomac by way of Gordonsville or Culpeper, while the rear would rest on Fredericksburg. He therefore desired the views of the government concerning the Army of the Potomac in such a contingency. He gave it decidedly as his opinion that it was his duty to attack Lee's rear as soon as the movement was fully developed. Mr. Lincoln replied to this dispatch with only an hour's delay, saying that so much of professional military skill was requisite to answer it that he had turned the task over to General Halleck. But the President himself decidedly disapproved of Hooker's suggestion to attack the enemy in Fredericksburg. The recollection of Burnside's disaster was too fresh in the minds of both the President and General Halleck to allow them to look with favor upon the project of attacking an army in position on a scene which had been already so fatal to our troops. The enemy would fight, said the President, quote, "in entrenchments, and have you at disadvantage, and so, man for man, worst you at that point, while his main force would in some way be getting an advantage of you northward. In one word, I would not take any risk of being entangled upon the river, like an ox jumped half over a fence and liable to be torn by dogs front and rear without a fair chance to gore one way or kick the other." Unquote. With this graphic metaphor, the President turned the military question involved over to the two generals. Halleck repeated the same idea in less vivid language. He thought it would be much better to attack the flank of Lee's movable column, rather than to cross the Rappahannock and fight the entrenched rear guard at Fredericksburg. While this correspondence was going on, the movement which Hooker suspected was in full progress. It had begun on the 3rd of June. McLaws' division of Longstreet's corps was the first body of troops to move from Fredericksburg to Culpeper Courthouse, and Hood's troops, from the Rapidan, had marched to the same place. On the 4th and 5th, Ewell's corps left Fredericksburg, so that when Sedgwick crossed below the city, the only force that confronted him was that of A.P. Hill. Although Hooker was not aware of the heavy force of Confederate infantry that had already arrived at Culpeper Courthouse, he knew there was a great concentration of cavalry near that place, and resolved to attack it. He sent a large force in that direction under Pleasonton and David McM. Gregg. The whole command was to rendezvous at Brandy Station and attack the enemy together. Unfortunately, as it resulted, they found the enemy at that point instead of at Culpeper, and not coming together at the same instant, they suffered the disadvantage almost inseparable from such a concentric movement, and were forced to fight in detail an enemy in position in superior numbers. It was one of the most important cavalry fights in the war. In fact, it is rare anywhere that a duel of 10,000 horsemen on a side is ever seen. Both armies fought with equal courage and nearly equal damage, and both sides, as a matter of course, congratulated themselves on a signal victory. The results which General Pleasonton claims to have accomplished were the breaking up of the enemy's plans, gaining valuable information, and so crippling the Confederate cavalry that they were unable to follow out their purpose to so protect the right wing of Lee's army as to screen his march along the eastern base of the Blue Ridge, thus compelling him to take the less desirable route by the Shenandoah Valley. Pleasonton even thought on the night of the battle that he had broken up the entire expedition, an illusion which Hooker did not share. General Hooker, having been convinced by the affair of Brandy Station that the bulk of the enemy's cavalry and a strong body of infantry were at Culpeper, and that the tendency of the rest of his infantry was to drift in that direction, conceived a bold and startling plan which he at once communicated to the President. It was nothing less than to march directly upon Richmond, brushing away the force left at Fredericksburg and leaving Lee's army on his right flank. He did not go so far as McClellan had done in adopting Lee's idea of "swapping queens." On the contrary, he thought that after taking Richmond, which he imagined would be a mere matter of capturing the provost guard, he could send from there all the disposable part of his army to any threatened point north of the Potomac. He thought there would be no difficulty in holding in check any force which might be thrown against Washington until his return. There is something in this proposition which stirs the blood of any soldier who reflects upon the exciting possibilities which it contains. If it had been attempted, and had succeeded, a world of blood and treasure would have been saved. Hooker would have gained one of the greatest names of modern times, and Lee's career would have ended in disaster, not unmingled with ridicule. But the suggestion was too extravagant and hazardous to commend itself to the calm judgment of the President. He answered without a moment's delay, "If left to me, I would not go south of Rappahannock upon Lee's moving north of it. If you had Richmond invested today, you would not be able to take it in 20 days. I think Lee's army, and not Richmond, is your sure objective point. If he comes towards the upper Potomac, follow on his flank and on his inside track, shortening your lines while he lengthens his. Fight him, too, when opportunity offers. If he stays where he is, fret him and fret him." Unquote. He wrote this dispatch before consulting Halleck, but the general-in-chief gave it his full approval, and there seems to be no question that the President's decision was the wisest which could have been taken. Lee sent his advance into the valley of the Shenandoah, and General Ewell invested the garrison of Winchester on the 13th. This post was held by General Milroy, a man of stubborn courage, who, when ordered to evacuate the place, instead of obeying, protested that he would be able to hold it against any force the enemy might bring. His orders were not repeated with sufficient promptness and firmness, and he was therefore caught by Ewell's army, and, though fighting obstinately, only escaped with the loss of a large proportion of his forces. On the very night when Ewell struck Winchester, Hill began his march up the Rappahannock, and Hooker also left the Aquia line, moving in accordance with the President's directions, pursuing the road indicated towards the upper Potomac. Before the President had heard of Milroy's disaster, he telegraphed to Hooker asking if he could afford any succor at Winchester. Drawing, in one of his vivid phrases, a picture of the condition of the rebel army, he said, "If the head of Lee's army is at Martinsburg, and the tail of it on the plank road between Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, the animal must be very slim somewhere. Could you not break him?" It was not until the night of the 15th of June that the President was able to telegraph to General Hooker a definite account of the loss of Winchester and Martinsburg, and to say that the enemy was crossing the Potomac at Williamsport. This left no doubt on Hooker's mind of the settled purpose of the enemy, though he thought that Lee would be more inclined to go north and west than to turn to the east. "He can have no design," said Hooker, in a dispatch to the President, "to look after his rear. It is an act of desperation on his part, no matter what force he moves." Unquote. In all Hooker's dispatches of this period, there is a tone of sullen reticence arising from his strained relations with General Halleck, which boded no good to the interests of the army. For instance, in this dispatch, written at a moment which called for the utmost exercise of all his energy and vigor, he says, quote, "I do not know that my opinion as to the duty of this army in the case is wanted. If it should be, you know that I would be happy to give it." Unquote. General Halleck, on the same day, had telegraphed him, quote, "Your army is entirely free to operate as you desire against Lee's army, so long as you keep his main army from Washington." Unquote. On the next day, the 16th of June, Hooker sent another dispatch to the President still more marked in its spirit of insubordination. Quote, "You have long been aware, Mr. President, that I have not enjoyed the confidence of the Major General commanding the army, and I can assure you, so long as this continues, we may look in vain for success, especially as future operations will require our relations to be more dependent upon each other than heretofore." Unquote. He continued to ask for instructions, complaining of the lack of information on the movements of the enemy, saying that he could not, quote, "divine his intentions so long as he fills the country with a cloud of cavalry." Unquote. The President, seeing that only disaster could follow the exhibition of such a spirit on the part of the general in command of a great army in the most momentous crisis of the war, responded in a tone of unusual sternness. Quote, "To remove all misunderstanding, I now place you in the strict military relation to General Halleck, of a commander of one of the armies to the general-in-chief of all the armies. I have not intended differently, but it seems to be differently understood. I shall direct him to give you orders, and you to obey them." Unquote. But at the same time he sent Hooker, by the hand of his young friend Captain Ulrich Dahlgren, a letter in which, laying aside his tone of authority, he pleaded with the gentlest persuasion for a better understanding between the two generals. He said, "My dear General, I send you this by the hand of Captain Dahlgren. Your dispatch of 11:30 a.m. today is just received. When you say I have long been aware that you do not enjoy the confidence of the Major General commanding, you state the case much too strongly. You do not lack his confidence in any degree to do you any harm. On seeing him, after telegraphing you this morning, I found him more nearly agreeing with you than I was myself. Surely you do not mean to understand that I am withholding my confidence from you, when I happen to express an opinion, certainly never discourteously, differing from one of your own. I believe Halleck is dissatisfied with you, to this extent only, that he knows that you write and telegraph, report as he calls it, to me. I think he is wrong to find fault with this, but I do not think he withholds any support from you on account of it. If you and he would use the same frankness to one another, and to me, that I use to both of you, there would be no difficulty. I need and must have the professional skill of both, and yet these suspicions tend to deprive me of both. I believe you are aware that since you took command of the army, I have not believed you had any chance to effect anything till now. As it looks to me, Lee's now returning towards Harper's Ferry gives you back the chance that I thought McClellan lost last fall. Quite possibly I was wrong, both then and now, but, in the great responsibility resting upon me, I cannot be entirely silent. Now, all I ask is that you will be in such mood that we can get into our action the best cordial judgment of yourself and General Halleck, with my poor mite added, if indeed he and you shall think it entitled to any consideration at all. Yours as ever, A. Lincoln. In short, the relations between General Halleck and General Hooker were rapidly becoming unendurable. An instinctive dislike between them, which dated from earlier days in California, had grown to a positive and active antipathy. The President had placed Hooker in command of the Army of the Potomac against the judgment and wishes of General Halleck. Hooker was made aware of this through the indiscretion of a member of the cabinet, and his trenchant comments upon the general-in-chief were promptly reported at headquarters. Every act of each was misinterpreted by the other. "It was sufficient for me," said Hooker on one occasion, "to make a request to have it refused." Halleck, on the other hand, was annoyed at the frequent and friendly communication between the President and Hooker. He affected to believe that he had no authority over the general. In a letter to the Secretary of War dated May 23, he pretended to have no information in regard to the Army of the Potomac since General Hooker assumed command, except that which he had received from the President, "to whom," he says, "General Hooker reports directly." It is hard to determine whether in this case, as in that of Burnside, he refrained from assuming responsibility more from punctilio than from indolence. It cannot be said that the coolness existed between the two generals had as yet affected injuriously the interests of the campaign in progress. General Hooker was moving his force from the line of Aquia to the Potomac with wonderful efficiency and skill, although the President saw, with some regret, that no movement was made against the long-stretched flank of Lee's army. It is undeniable that Hooker was pursuing the wisest course in swinging his army around on the inside of a parallel arc to that occupied by Lee, and in doing this he was only following out the President's clear and judicious orders of the 10th. The march of his army to the Potomac was scarcely less able and successful than his famous movement across the Rappahannock and Rapidan, and on General Halleck's part it does not appear that General Hooker's complaints of malevolent interference were valid. Generals Heintzelman and Wool were ordered to report to him constantly. He was given full command of their troops, except those specially set apart for the defense of Washington, and all that part of the Middle Department east of Cumberland, which was commanded by General Schenck, was placed under Hooker's direct orders. General Hooker's action was never more intelligent and energetic than at this time. He made no mistakes, and he omitted nothing that could properly be done, although he complained of Lee's "cloud of cavalry," which prevented him from obtaining information of his movements. He managed his own cavalry with such vigor and efficiency that the enemy was kept equally in the dark. The superiority of the Confederate cavalry had disappeared with the McClellan regime, from the time Hooker assumed command, and more especially from the hour in which Pleasonton took the mounted force in hand. The Union cavalry began to meet their opponents upon equal terms, and at every encounter where the forces were not disproportionate, they gained the advantage. It had been the hope and expectation of Lee to hold the passes of the Bull Run Mountains with his cavalry, and behind that living screen to use the east and the west slopes of the Blue Ridge for the march of his army northward. But the energy and skill with which the Union cavalry was managed rendered this plan abortive. At Aldie, at Middleburg, at Thoroughfare Gap, and at every point where the Confederate cavalry appeared, they were attacked by Pleasonton and his subordinates, Gregg, Buford, and Judson Kilpatrick, and driven backward in every fight, until at last Stuart retired to Ashby's Gap under the protection of Longstreet's infantry. But these successes of his cavalry did not tempt Hooker to any imprudent advance upon the flank of the enemy. General Lee says in his report that Longstreet's advance upon the east side of the Blue Ridge and his occupation of the passes were for the purpose of drawing Hooker farther from his base. But even the advance of Ewell across the river, and the news of the panic and terror his cruel exactions were exciting among the peaceful farmers of Maryland and Pennsylvania, did not have the desired effect of drawing Hooker away from his well-considered plan. Seeing himself outmaneuvered in this respect, General Lee withdrew Longstreet from the passes, and sent him down the valley after Ewell, where Hill had already preceded him. Stuart was left alone to guard the passes of the mountains and to watch the movements of Hooker. The duty assigned him, besides keeping Lee informed of every movement of the Union army, was to worry and harass it as much as possible, and try to delay or even prevent its crossing of the Potomac. This was a task, as it proved, far beyond his powers. He had all he could do to defend himself from harassment and annoyance. Every time he approached the Federal force he was beaten off, and at last, relinquishing all hope of effecting anything against Hooker's moving host, he struck to the eastward and performed his favorite feat of riding around the Union army. He crossed the Potomac at Seneca Creek, captured a train at Rockville, made a long and fatiguing detour at a great distance from the right flank of the National forces, lost his way between York and Carlisle, and after 6 days of desperate marching and frequent unsuccessful engagements, during which he accomplished little except to weary and cripple a great portion of his command, he joined the main body of Lee on the evening of the 2nd of July, too late to be of any real service in the invasion of Pennsylvania. By the 24th of June, General Lee says, the progress of Ewell rendered it necessary that the rest of the army should be within supporting distance. He therefore put the columns of Longstreet and Hill at once in movement, and they both crossed the Potomac without opposition, the one at Williamsport, the other at Shepherdstown, and coming together at Hagerstown, they crossed Mason and Dixon's line and encamped for the first time on free soil near Chambersburg on the 27th of June. On account of the failure of his cavalry, Lee was acting in entire ignorance of Hooker's movements, but with that contempt of his enemy which was one source of strength to him, and a source of weakness as well, he pushed forward, trusting to meet every emergency as it arose. His only fear seems to have been that Hooker might push his forces west of South Mountain, and thus cut off his communications with Virginia. To prevent this, he caused Early's division to be sent as far east as possible, hoping by this demonstration to frighten his antagonist away from his own line. The march of Ewell had spread the wildest terror and consternation among the rural population on his route. The farmers, who were harvesting their crops, saw the fruits of their year's labor snatched from them in a moment, their horses and cattle driven away, and in the lower Shenandoah and in Maryland, their Negro neighbors seized to be sold into slavery in the South. There was a great show of justice and fairness in the orders and proclamations of General Lee. Everything seized was to be paid for, but as payment was made in Confederate scrip, which was absolutely worthless outside of the rebel lines, it may be thought that General Lee has received more credit than is due to him for this pretense of scrupulosity. His army, as a matter of course, gave a liberal interpretation to his orders. Letters printed in Southern papers from correspondents in the army treated them as a dead letter, and ridiculed the idea that the starving soldiers of the South should not enjoy the fatness of the enemy's country. All the plunder which was not needed for immediate use was sent down the Cumberland Valley and across the river. The panic-stricken farmers fled in every direction, but principally to the north. The roads were encumbered with melancholy caravans of fugitives, bearing their families and their household goods away from the scene of danger, the whites trying to rescue as much of their stores as they could hastily gather together, and the unhappy negroes to save themselves and their families from capture, sale, and lifelong separation. Among the rich cities of central Pennsylvania, and even as far as Philadelphia in the east and Pittsburgh in the west, there was great excitement and concern. General Lee was bearing directly upon Harrisburg, a great center of trade and railway transportation, the capture and destruction of which would have inflicted a staggering blow upon the prosperity of the state. As early as the 15th of June, the President, foreseeing this invasion, had called into the service of the United States 100,000 militia from the states of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Maryland, and West Virginia, to serve for 6 months, unless sooner discharged. The governors of all these states had promptly responded to this proclamation, and summoned the militia to stated places of rendezvous. The governors of New York and New Jersey had also called upon their citizens to go to the assistance of their neighbors. These calls were responded to with promptness, and a large number of militia and unorganized bodies of citizens thronged the railroads to the banks of the Susquehanna. It is probable that they would not have offered much resistance to the disciplined army of Lee, but the show of force which they made was doubtless of service in checking his advance. None of his forces crossed the river. Ewell's corps took possession of the city of Carlisle, and a division under Early was sent to York, which it occupied on the 28th of June. He laid that place under heavy contribution, demanding $100,000 in cash and a large amount of provisions and clothing, in consideration of which he kindly refrained from destroying the town. The bridge over the Susquehanna at Columbia was destroyed just before the Confederate cavalry reached it. A system of fortifications was hastily thrown up south of the Susquehanna at Harrisburg, but the force of militia under General Couch, though it was not called into actual battle, was probably more effective than these works in preventing an attack upon that city. This state of excitement and terror in the peaceful towns and villages of Pennsylvania found its contre-coup in the city of Richmond. The demonstration made by the Union forces under General Dix threw the Confederate capital into great panic. The entire male population was called to the defense of the works, and it was even proposed to call boys from 12 to 18 into the service. The forces under Colonel Spears destroyed the bridge over the South Anna, and among other captures brought in General W. F. Lee and a less valuable prize of $15,000 in Confederate bonds, taken from an agent of the Richmond government. The operations of Pleasanton having brushed the enemy entirely out of Loudoun County and given General Hooker control of the Potomac below Harper's Ferry, he was able to choose at perfect leisure his time and place for crossing the river. He waited until Lee's whole army was on the north side, and then crossed at Edwards Ferry. He directed General Reynolds to seize the passes of the South Mountain so as not only to anticipate the enemy in their possession, but also to confine him to a single line of invasion west of those hills. He then directed Reynolds with the 1st, 3rd, and 11th Corps to take position at Middletown. He determined at once to strike the point where General Lee was most sensitive, to push a strong column directly west upon his line of communications, and to keep the rest of his army in position to support it. The feeling of grievance which he had towards General Halleck had not for a moment influenced his action or impeded his zealous activity, but the feeling remained, and on the 27th, just before leaving Poolesville to make a personal inspection of the post of Harper's Ferry, he telegraphed to the General-in-Chief, somewhat in the old familiar tone of McClellan before a battle, that his whole force of enlisted men for duty would not exceed 105,000, adding that he stated these facts so that more might not be expected of him than he had material to do with. He had previously sent General Butterfield, his chief of staff, to Washington and Baltimore in the hope of organizing a strong movable corps to reinforce him on his crossing. At Washington, General Halleck had assured him that there was not a man who could be spared from the defense of the city, and at Baltimore, General Schenck, with all the goodwill possible, could only raise a force of 2,100. His scouts and spies were continually bringing him information of the strength of Lee's army, and, as usual, in such cases, their estimates were much exaggerated. There was no soldier in our army of stouter heart than Hooker, and he seemed in this campaign to have recovered all that keenness of insight and steadiness of judgment which was obscured for a while at Chancellorsville. Nevertheless, it is clear that a feeling of something like despondency attacked him after he had transported his army across the Potomac. He seemed to feel that too much was expected of him, that anything but the most brilliant successes would be viewed in the disparaging light of Chancellorsville, that the country demanded that he should not only protect the capital, but destroy the rebel army, and in view of the impression he had received as to Lee's superior numbers, he began to think that such a task might not be possible with the force he had. In this frame of mind he wished to dispose absolutely of every man within his reach, and it seemed a personal affront to him if any troops he asked for were withheld from him. Before starting for Harper's Ferry, he sent a dispatch to General Halleck, asking if there were any reason why Maryland Heights could not be abandoned after the public stores and property were removed, and after going to that point, his conviction was confirmed that the large force there was utterly wasted for any practical purpose. His plan was to march the 12th Corps in that direction, to join to them the garrison of Maryland Heights, and with this considerable force to move upon Lee's rear, to destroy his bridges if there were any left, and to drive away his guard and intercept the opulent flow of stores, grain, horses, and cattle which Ewell was pouring down the Cumberland Valley into Virginia. On the ground he could see more clearly than ever that the troops there were useless. They guarded no ford of the Potomac. The place was not in itself defensible. Its sole apparent purpose was to protect a railroad bridge. The engineer in charge, Colonel Reynolds, agreed with him that if it were ever of any use, it was certainly useless now, when the rebel army had passed above it in force. As General Hooker afterward said, quote, "Even if it were the key to Maryland, of what value was the key after the door was smashed in?" Unquote. He sat down to write an order for the abandonment of the post, when to his deep disappointment he received a dispatch from General Halleck saying, quote, "Maryland Heights have always been regarded as an important point to be held by us, and much expense and labor incurred in fortifying them. I cannot approve their abandonment except in case of absolute necessity." Unquote. General Hooker immediately replied, reiterating his conviction that the troops were wasted there, that even if the works were abandoned, no enemy would ever take possession of them, that under present circumstances the force left there was merely a bait for the rebels should they return. But no such reply as this, no mere expression of his opinion could satisfy the deep feeling of resentment and disappointment with which he received General Halleck's dispatch. He wrote and sent at the same moment another telegram saying that he was unable, with the means at his disposal, to cover Harper's Ferry and Washington, and to fight an enemy in his front of more than his numbers. He therefore requested to be at once relieved from the position he occupied. It will always be impossible to say whether General Hooker intended to be taken at his word. We believe he never gave the slightest intimation that he intended to allow the government the alternative of yielding to his wishes or accepting his resignation. But the situation was so critical and time was so precious that none could be lost in parley or delay. General James A. Hardee was at once dispatched to the headquarters of the army with the message relieving General Hooker, at his own request, and appointing in his place General George Gordon Meade, commanding the 5th Corps. General Meade had served with distinction on almost every battlefield of the Army of the Potomac. He enjoyed the respect and esteem of all its officers and men, with perhaps the sole exception of his predecessor. For as when Burnside was deposed, the person most ungrateful to his feelings was put in his place, so now, by a strange caprice of fortune, Hooker himself was to drain the cup he had made so bitter for Burnside, and was to hand over the baton of command to his most conspicuous critic. Ever since the Battle of Chancellorsville, the relations between the two officers had been so unfriendly that when Hardee arrived at Meade's tent with an official envelope and a look of unusual solemnity, the latter thought it was an order of arrest for himself. Meade was a tall, thin, reserved man, very nearsighted, with the air of the student rather than of the saberer. He had none of the genial gifts and graces which were in different ways possessed by all of those who had preceded him in command, but he was well known as an able and energetic soldier, of approved courage and calm judgment in difficult circumstances, and it is in evidence of his own worth and of the splendid moral qualities of the great army he commanded, that this perilous change, made in a moment of supreme importance, was accepted both by him and his soldiery without an instant of confusion or hesitation. They went on in the line of duty without breaking step, without a tremor of the pulse. Hooker gave his congratulations in his usual hearty and chivalrous manner. He complimented Meade in general orders as, quote, "a brave and accomplished officer, who has nobly earned the confidence and esteem of this army on many a well-fought field." Unquote. He took leave of his comrades in touching and generous words, and then rode away from the Army of the Potomac forever. One could not help a feeling of regret at this sudden termination of Hooker's command. He had never exhibited more vigor and ability, more insight and capacity, than in this fortnight which preceded his resignation. Every step of the way, from Falmouth to Frederick, he had shown the finest qualities of generalship. He had known when to move and when to halt, when to strike and when to refrain from striking. When he was relieved, he was on his way to the very point where Lee considered his armor the weakest. If he had remained in command, with his clearness of vision and boldness in planning, joining with that impetuosity of attack which he showed on every occasion, except once in his life, it is easy to imagine what splendid results he might have accomplished for the cause he had so intensely at heart. But when, on the other hand, we reflect how feebly he concluded at Chancellorsville the work he had so magnificently begun, how suddenly and unaccountably the daring will, the brilliant intellect, of the 30th of April became clouded with doubt and hesitation the next day, and passed into disastrous eclipse on the 3rd of May, we cannot but admit that the President was right in taking alarm at the querulous tone of his dispatches from Poolesville and Harper's Ferry, and in concluding that a general who resigns his commission on the eve of battle should always have his resignation accepted, let the consequences be what they may. End of Chapter 8. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois.